Welcome back to Anti-Social Studies. During the last few videos, we rebelled against the British and we won. Whoa, who saw that one coming? Now we're going to look at the first generation of independent US American history. Winning a war or conquering a place is kind of the easy part. Governing is way harder. Now we can sum up the main issues of the first two US presidents in this way. Domestically, they were trying to figure out how their new country was going to make money. And with foreign affairs, they were trying to figure out how the heck to stay out of the centuries-old rivalry between Britain and France. That was it. Those are the two biggest issues. I guess we can talk about it a little more if you really want to. George Washington was basically forced to be president. After the war, he just wanted to retire to Virginia, but to the public and the other founding fathers, he was the only person they wanted to be the first leader of the new nation. The very first presidential campaign really included a massive grassroots movement, but it wasn't to defeat an opponent, it was just to convince George to accept the job. By the way, I expect letters to start flooding in my mailbox any day, convincing me that I should take over as President of the United States. I'll wait. Washington sighed, I guess I'll be the leader of a country, and chose John Adams as his vice president to ease sectional tensions between his southern state of Virginia and Adams's New England. By the way, he tried to get out of a second term, saying he was tired, old, and sick, but his cabinet was not having it. He didn't even really have to run for president. He just kind of never said that he wouldn't consider a second term, and everyone just kept on going with their lives. To be honest, George probably could have been president until he died, but he understood the importance of precedent. Not president, precedent. As the first president, every decision he made would color future generations' interpretations of what a president could and couldn't do. So honestly, thanks, George, for being a pretty solid first president, all things considered. The biggest issue facing Washington and his successor, John Adams, was money. The US was in debt and couldn't figure out the best way forward. They had just fought a revolution over taxation, so direct taxes weren't really an option. Pretty much the only money they were making was from tariffs on foreign goods. And in walks Alexander Hamilton. You rang? Now, I'm not going to go into Hamilton's whole backstory because I'm not Lin-Manuel Miranda, but just know that he was basically an annoying genius who believed in a strong federal government, and he did his part as Secretary of the Treasury to ensure that this would be the case. So what did Hamilton want to do? Full disclosure, I'm terrible at economics, so I'm going to explain this at surface level, maybe, and then we're going to move on. Okay, great. This is where it's great to have a YouTube channel instead of a classroom full of teenagers ready to ask me questions about tariffs that I don't understand. Now, Hamilton wanted a fiscally strong national state, and he wanted everyone living in the US to have faith in that federal government. At the end of the war, during the Articles period, each state had its own debts to pay, and they were dealing with them separately. Hamilton proposed that the federal government should take responsibility or assume all state debts. Now, for the states, this probably seems great, right? You racked up a huge bill during the war, and now some guy is saying, I got this. But anti-federalists, people who were scared of a strong federal government, saw this as a power grab. This was a way to assert that the federal government was supreme in issues related to money. And also, some states had less debt than others, so those states weren't super happy at the idea that they would now be responsible for the debts incurred by other states. But Hamilton and Washington understood the psychological importance of this move. They needed to show the United States that they truly were one united country instead of a bunch of loosely organized former colonies. And Hamilton used the Treasury to do that. He also redeemed promissory notes, or IOUs, that the Continental Congress had issued during the Revolution and began issuing new federal bonds, all of which was meant to show the public that this new government was stable and intended to be around for a while, and like the Lannisters, would always pay its debts. Well, until now. We're $22 trillion in debt? That'll be low by the time I publish this episode. Sorry, George. Hamilton later went on to establish the first bank in the United States using the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution to argue that the power to create a national bank was implied in the Constitution. Now, I'm not going to get into it too much because, spoiler alert, the Bank of the US is going to be dead in just a few episodes. I'm looking at you, Andrew Jackson. In return for accepting Hamilton's Federalist economic plan, Jefferson and Madison got the new capital located in the South on the Potomac River. This was the Compromise of 1790 that was hammered out in The Room Where It Happens, according to Burr / Lin-Manuel Miranda. Side note, George Washington never served as president in Washington, D.C. He was inaugurated in New York City, and he oversaw the beginning of the building of the brand new city, basically in the middle of a swamp built from scratch by enslaved people, that would later be named after him. And I know that some of us probably don't really think of D.C. today as the South, but it is. It's below the Mason-Dixon line and is settled in nicely between Maryland and Virginia. Washington faced other domestic issues as well, but they were pretty much all related to the government trying to make money. They still needed to make some money fast, so they did begin some direct taxes, most notably a tax on all distilled spirits. Man, don't piss off drunk people, George. They're like the most likely to rebel. The so-called whiskey tax disproportionately hurt farmers on the frontier. Right now, the frontier is like in western Pennsylvania. Weird, right? Especially because during the Revolutionary War, many of them hadn't been able to sell their grain, so they distilled it into whiskey to preserve their wealth. Washington quickly suppressed the so-called Whiskey Rebellion, establishing that federal law is the supreme law of the land. Remember, up until about 3 years ago, Americans were either completely separate colonies that ran their own show, or they were loosely connected states under the Articles of Confederation. George's main job was to unite the states under his leadership, and through Hamilton's economic plans and ending the Whiskey Rebellion, he did just that. Outside the United States, the French Revolution had begun. Our guy Lafayette was over in Paris writing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and you would think that his old buddies, now the leaders of the new nation, would jump to support another democratic revolution against a tyrannical monarch, right? Not so much. I mean, we did send France money to help them suppress a slave revolt in their colony of Haiti. We were like, we're all for democracy and fighting for freedom and liberty against an oppressive mother country, if you're white, I guess. As for the French Revolution, George stayed out of it, believing that the US was too weak and unstable to fight a war right now. Remember that France was also fighting against a lot of other major European powers at the same time. So it really was too much for us to take on. After a brief kerfuffle with Citizen Genet, a Frenchman who was trying to stir up pro-French support in the form of men and ships, Washington issued a Proclamation of Neutrality. If you remember anything from Washington's presidency, you probably remember his farewell address. This was an incredibly famous speech that he gave when he finally was stepping down after his second term. Remember, he was doing this voluntarily. There were no term limits yet on how many times someone could run and become president. I highly recommend you go actually just read that document. It really feels like George Washington, or really Alexander Hamilton, who wrote it for him, was a time traveler predicting some of our modern issues. But for now, just know that Washington kind of gave his advice to the nation and we ignored most of it. He very famously said, don't get into debt. It's going to make us beholden to whoever we're indebted to. It's kind of the definition. Number 2, don't form political parties. It's going to divide us and it's going to make it hard for us to ever come together. Number 3, stay out of European affairs, stay out of any sort of entangling alliances. And 4, that we needed to work really hard to make sure that the various regions of the United States were fully committed to unity, North, South, and West, all recognizing that they needed each other together and they could be more powerful together as a national economy than apart. If you know anything about US history, you know just how much we ignored all of that advice, but it was good advice. Okay, so Adams takes over in 1797, and he has basically the same problems as George: how to make money and how to stay out of the British-French rivalry. For the money, he issued the first direct tax on property, which led to rebellions. Man, Americans really hate taxes. As a result of those rebellions, Congress passed the fairly problematic Alien and Sedition Acts that, 1, made it harder for an immigrant to become a citizen, 2, allowed the president to imprison and deport non-citizens who were deemed dangerous, and 3, put people in prison for making false statements that were critical of the federal government. Ugh, chill, Adams. It's called the First Amendment. You really should know it because you were literally there when it was written. These new laws made Adams a fairly unpopular president, and they were repealed under Jefferson, but they show us a few things. First, just how tenuous the government's control over the people was in the early years. And also how easily we could have strayed into dictatorship land, like what happened in France with Napoleon. The founding fathers had plenty of flaws, but all things considered, and by this I mean, slavery and the patriarchy and general elitism, as far as political minds and a good faith effort to compromise for the good of the nation, we kind of hit the jackpot on enlightened men who would steer our country in the direction of democracy. Conflict between France and Britain was growing, and the US, who was just trying to be neutral and trade with whoever would trade with us, kept getting caught in the middle. More specifically, our ships were getting caught, literally, by both British and French ships who didn't want goods going to their enemy. President Adams sent delegates to France to negotiate for our ships back, but the French diplomats bribed the Americans before they would even meet with them. We were like, you can't do that. We're America. Which didn't really work yet because America was like a super weak, brand new country that no one else thought would last. So instead, we just publicly shamed them, and that did the trick. Adams exposed the scandal. He named the 3 French delegates as X, Y, and Z, so it became known as the XYZ affair. In addition, Adams told American ships that they could harass French ships if they didn't back off. We expanded the Navy. At the time, it was literally just one boat. That was our whole permanent Navy. Adams put George Washington in charge of the new Navy, who was like, oh my God, can I please just go home? Washington made Hamilton his second in command and basically just let Hamilton run the Navy. And everyone else was like, oh my God, why is Hamilton always here? But when Napoleon took over in France, he had bigger fish to fry, namely all of Europe to conquer. And so he quickly negotiated peace with the US and turned his attention eastward. Good luck invading Russia in the winter. So, when Jefferson came into office, everyone in Europe had turned their attention toward Napoleon, and the US was finally able to take a deep breath and have a brief existential crisis. More on that next episode. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.